Good morning. Welcome to the second lecture on electrolytes, fluid balances, and acid base. This morning, let's talk about Proverbs 30, chapter 30, verse 5. Every word of God proves true. He is a shield to those who take refuge in Him. I know things are tough and a bit overwhelming. I pray for you guys every day. I want you to know that take your refuge in God and He will take care of you. One of the great things about the creation of our body is the way God has set up balance in our body. And so today we're going to look at not only electrolyte balances, but also how God set up our chemical system to make sure that we stay in an acid-base balance. So when we look at electrolyte balance, mainly we're talking about salt. Electrolytes include acid bases and some proteins, but the most of the time we're going to look at salts and how they control the movements in our body. Then how do we take in salts? Mainly we eat them. Metabolism, it produces some, and they're basically lost by respiration, feces, urine, and vomit. And when our salts are out of balance, then our water is out of balance, and this can cause major metabolic problems. So you have this table 26.1, and it lists the important ions. I want you to know the ion, the abnormality, and the consequences. So under sodium, you'd need to know the term hypernatremia. What does that mean? It means too much sodium. And then the consequence, if we're lucky, is simply we get thirsty. But this could also lead to problems, cognitive problems, lethargy, muscle pain. So think about that. Hyponatremia is not enough sodium, and so we're looking at neurologic dysfunctions. Not good, not good. So take time to go through this table. This is part A, and here is part B. Know the major ions, their abnormalities, and the consequences of that abnormality. What about imbalances? When we have electrolyte deficiencies, then first thing our body will do is say, we need to eat something. So salty foods or sour foods, when we look at you want to eat salty snacks, chips, chips, or sour foods like pickles. I love kosher dill pickles, excellent. And then another imbalance is called pica, P-I-C-A, pica. And this is when a person eats really weird things like dirt or clay or chalk or burnt match tips. Usually it's caused by a deficiency in minerals. This is, for example, iron. I think it'd be a lot easier just to take a multivitamin. So what's the central role or the basic role of sodium? It is the most abundant cation in the external or extracellular fluid, and notice that it's going to contribute 280 milliosmoles of the total 300 milliosmoles in the extracellular fluid. It is the only cation that is significant in osmotic pressure because wherever sodium goes, water follows. So we know that sodium leaks into the cells and is pumped out against its electrochemical gradient. We studied this in the nervous system and in the cardiovascular system. And it is going to be regulated with the renal acid-base control mechanisms. So concentration of sodium determines the osmolality of the extracellular fluid and is going to influence, of course, the membrane potential on neurons and muscles. But the content, okay, the total body content determines the extracellular fluid volume and thus blood pressure. And we've talked about this when we talked about blood pressure. So this table very nicely summarizes concentration versus content of sodium. Please study it. We don't know of any receptors that monitor sodium, but we do know that the sodium-water balance is linked to blood pressure and blood volume, and these have very distinctive tight control mechanisms. So when we look at this, a change in blood pressure or volume triggers controls that regulate sodium content. Regulation of sodium content is by the influence of aldosterone and angiotensin II. And we've been over this when we looked at blood pressure and when we looked at kidneys. So aldosterone plays the biggest role in regulating sodium, and this is via the kidneys, so that sodium is never secreted into the filtrate, mainly because 65% of the sodium is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules, and that 25% is reclaimed in the sodium is reclaimed in the nephron tubes. So when we look at aldosterone and its concentration is high, then sodium is being actively reabsorbed into the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting tubules, and because sodium is being actively reabsorbed, water is going to follow it, and this means that extracellular fluid volume increases. When aldosterone level concentrations are low, that means sodium is not being actively reabsorbed. It's lost to the urine, and water always follows sodium. Therefore, there's an increased loss of water. Renin and angiotensin aldosterone mechanism is the major trigger for aldosterone release, so that when there's a decreased filtrate sodium chloride concentration, then renin is going to be secreted. Okay? Renin catalyzes angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. This causes aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex, and that results in an increased reabsorption of sodium by the kidney tubules. And if sodium is being reabsorbed, what follows it? You're right, water. Aldosterone release can also be triggered by increased potassium levels in the extracellular fluid. Now, aldosterone is going to take hours to days to get things back into balance, whereas angiotensin 2 works pretty fast in prompting aldosterone release. So here is the chart that shows you how everything works. And notice that if sodium is being reabsorbed, potassium is being secreted. And what this does is bring sodium potassium levels back into balance. So hypoaldosteronism, or Addison's disease, means that your patient's not producing aldosterone. So sodium chloride is being lost in the urine, and of course water always follows salt, and this leads to a very dilute urine. Another way that sodium is regulated is through ANP, atrionatriuretic peptide. And remember that this is secreted by the cells in the atrium, and mainly in response to increased blood pressure. So ANP is going to inhibit ADH, renin, and aldosterone. And by doing this, it increases the excretion of sodium. Of course, water follows sodium, so water is excreted. And that is going to decrease extracellular fluid volume, which, of course, is going to include decreasing the volume of the blood, and thus you have a decrease in blood pressure. So here are the mechanisms and the consequences. And what we see, okay, is sodium and water are excreted in the urine, and that decreases blood volume, and that's going to decrease blood pressure. Notice that AMP also is going to cause vasodilation, and that will decrease blood pressure as well. What about other hormones? Well, ladies, we are all very familiar with retaining water during that special time of month. So estrogens increase sodium chloride reabsorption, and of course water follows salt, and that means we get water retention. Bummer. And this is also because estrogen is high during pregnancy. This is why pregnant women oftentimes have problems with edema in their legs and feet. Progesterone is our friend. It decreases sodium reabsorption, and this promotes sodium and water loss. And then there are some glucocorticoids, in other words steroids, that increase sodium reabsorption, and this promotes edema. Now remember, edema is excess fluid in the tissues. Last part, cardiovascular baroreceptors. Okay, remember, baro means pressure, and so these baroreceptors tell the brain whether there's an increase or decrease in blood volume and thus blood pressure. And so basically what happens is that the sympathetic nervous system impulses or messages to the kidney decline, and this is going to result in an increase in sodium and water output, and that decreases blood volume, and by decreasing blood volume we decrease blood pressure. Isn't it fascinating how all these things take place? And they're auto-regulation. We don't think about it. We don't think about, oh, I have too much, volume and I've got high blood pressure. We don't our body just takes care of it. And I think that is one of the most fascinating things that God did when He created us is how this system of check and balances keep us very healthy. So when you look at all this together, oh my goodness, it really has more to do with the flow of sodium and thus the flow of water, because water always follows sodium. So take time and look at this chart, familiarize yourself with what's taking place and how everything is integrated together. This would be a good time for you to pause and check your notes, go back to the book and star particular sections that you know are important, um, and to go over the information. Potassium is a very important cation because it drives the resting membrane potential in our muscle cells, especially the cardiac muscle cells and the neurons. Without potassium, then we don't get the membrane potential that is necessary to make sure that our electrical system works properly. So if we have high levels of potassium in the extracellular fluid, it's called hyperkalemia. Kal means potassium. All right? And so what does this mean? It means that the resting membrane potential decreases. That causes depolarization. That means our cells are not properly excitable. That is increase. A decrease in extracellular potassium, okay, is hypokalemia. This causes hyperpolarization. And what does that mean? That means that resting membrane will not respond, and we don't have any electrical charge moving. So when we look at this, the heart is especially sensitive to potassium levels. And whether it's hyper or hypo, this means the electrical conduction system is not working properly, and this leads to sudden death. People drop dead. Potassium is also very important in the buffer system. So when we buffer acids and bases, because protons shift in and out in the opposite direction of potassium. So if we have extra ECF potassium levels rise with acidosis, and ECF potassium levels fall with alkalosis. And once again, if the acid-base balance is out of whack, the potassium balance is out of whack, and this means our resting membrane potential is out of whack. Thus, we don't have electrical currents, no electrical currents, or improper electrical currents. We have heart problems, and we have central nervous system problems. So where is this regulated? Mainly in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So this is going to regulate the amount of potassium that is secreted, got it? Secreted into the filtrate. So if ECF has high level of potassium, then the principal cells are going to secrete potassium. If there are low levels of potassium, then the principal cells are going to reduce secretion. So this means that potassium is left in the filtrate. So the kidneys are going to have an ability to retain potassium. Most potassium will be lost in the urine. And if we don't replace it in our diet, then we have a deficiency. In the United States and other industrialized nations, there's very rarely any deficiency in sodium, but potassium deficiency can be a problem. Potassium is found in our leafy greens, and a lot of us don't eat the vegetables that we need to eat. So what does plasma potassium concentration have to do with all of this? Well, it's the most important factor affecting potassium secretion because of plasma potassium being in the extracellular fluid. So a diet high in potassium leads to increased potassium in the extracellular fluid, and this will cause the potassium to be secreted. Okay, low potassium diet, or if we lose potassium due to too much secretion, then we have limited reabsorption. What about aldosterone? Well, aldosterone is going to stimulate potassium secretion and sodium reabsorption. So the adrenal cortical cells are very sensitive to potassium in the extracellular fluid in the plasma. So that increased potassium in the adrenal cortex causes release of aldosterone. Aldosterone means sodium is going to be what? Taken up. And what does that mean? Potassium is secreted. So potassium controls its own extracellular concentration by using feedback regulation of aldosterone. What about some of the clinical problems? Most of our salt substitutes are potassium chloride. And if you use too much of this, then you can cause potassium imbalances. So any kind of abnormalities in aldosterone can cause problems. We can have, in the absence of aldosterone, hyperkalemia, and it is lethal. And if a person has a tumor that pumps out a lot of aldosterone, then the ECF potassium levels fall so low that the neurons hyperpolarize, and this leads to paralysis, and paralysis leads to death. So draw a line here, and we're going to talk about calcium and phosphate. So 99% of the body's calcium is in the bones, is calcium phosphate. You remember this from our study of the skeletal system. Parathyroid hormone, which you'll remember from the study of the skeletal system and our happy endocrine chapter, is going to control calcium balance. And this is such a tight control that there's very little deviation. So PTH is going to target the bones. It'll cause the osteoclast to break down the bone matrix, releasing calcium and phosphate. And then it will work on the kidneys to increase calcium reabsorption and decrease phosphate ion reabsorption. Why is calcium important? Well, remember, it's calcium that is necessary for muscle contractions. The small intestine is going to increase calcium reabsorption, okay? And this helps to activate vitamin D. So filtered calcium is reabsorbed due to PTH. If extracellular calcium levels are normal, PTH will not be secreted, and everything is cool. So if we look at the filtered phosphates, remember that they are reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. All right? So phosphate reabsorption is going to be affected by insulin, High levels of insulin increase phosphate reabsorption, and glucagon. High levels of glucagon decrease phosphate reabsorption. So when we look here, what do we see? If we see hypocalcemia in the blood, PTH is released. That's going to activate the osteoclast to break down bone and release calcium and phosphate. It's going to cause calcium reabsorption in the kidney tubules and activate vitamin D. All right. Increased calcium absorption from food in the small intestine. Yay! Is going to result in increased calcium in the blood, increased calcium reabsorption in the kidney tubules, causes increased calcium in the blood and release of calcium and phosphate into the blood, of course, causes a rise in calcium blood. Calcium, remember, is important for blood clotting, cell membrane permeability, different secretory activities, and especially neuromuscular excitability. So hypocalcemia, all right, increases neuromuscular excitability, and that can lead to tetany. And hypercalcemia inhibits neurons and muscle cells and may cause heart arrhythmias. So when we look at this, and the cations, we looked at all the cations. Let's look at some of the anions. Chloride is the major anion, and of course it's nearly always with sodium. It helps maintain osmotic pressure, and the vast majority of chloride is reabsorbed. Okay, it's going to passively follow sodium in the proximal convoluted tubules and then is actively transported with sodium in other tubules. If acidosis occurs, fewer chloride ions are reabsorbed. Other anions then are going to have maximum transport, and any excesses are excreted in the urine, and this includes the sulfates and the nitrates. All right, take a break. We're about to get into section 4 of acid-base balance, and this is fairly intense, so you need to pause. You need to go to the bathroom or get something to eat, get that glucose up so that you can really pay attention. pH is going to affect proteins, and the vast majority of our enzymes are proteins. If a protein can't function, then metabolic biochemical reactions don't function. So this is very, very closely regulated. Normal pH, you notice that arterial blood is at 7.4, venous blood and interstitial blood or fluid has an average pH of 7.35, and inside the cell is a pH of 7. Alkalosis is when arterial pH is greater than 7.45, and acidosis is when arterial pH is less than 7.35. Please note, this is a very, very tight balance. All right? So let's pay attention here. So small amounts of acidic substances enter by food, but most of the proton is produced as a byproduct of metabolism. So phosphorus-containing proteins that are broken down release phosphoric acid into the extracellular fluid. Lactic acid from anaerobic respiration enters into the extracellular fluid, and then fatty acids and keto bodies from fat metabolism add acid, and then protons are liberated when CO2 is converted into bicarbonate in the blood. So what we see is a concentration of hydrogen ions regulated by 3 mechanisms. Okay, hydrogen ions being regulated. The chemical buffer system, which is rapid and it's the first thing that happens. The brainstem respiratory systems kick in about 3 minutes, and then the renal mechanisms, which are the most potent, but they take hours to days to affect pH changes. In the chemical buffer systems, what we're going to see is that strong acids are going to be completely disassociated into water, and so they dramatically affect the pH. What the body does is it changes a strong acid into a weak acid, because weak acids only dissociate partially in water, and they buffer or prevent pH changes. Now, in the same way, strong bases disassociate easily in water, and they quickly tie up the proton. And so that's going to cause a drastic shift in pH. What the body does is that it changes a strong base into a weak base that accepts the protons more slowly, and this buffers the change in pH. So this picture shows you hydrochloric acid, which is a very strong acid, and how it falls apart in water into protons and chlorides. Whereas a weak acid, such as carbonic acid, all right, doesn't disassociate easily in water. And so it is going to buffer how many protons are going to be released into the water or into the system. So the big thing here, look at this, the big concept, chemical buffer is a system of one or more compounds that act to resist pH changes when a strong acid or base is added. You got that? Chemical buffer. The three major buffering systems are the bicarbonate buffer system, the phosphate buffer system, and the protein buffer system. The bicarbonate buffer system is going to mix carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, and the salts of bicarbonate, such as sodium bicarb. These buffers are going to be intracellular and extracellular, but they're only important in the extracellular buffer system. So if a strong acid like hydrochloric acid, where on God's green earth in your body do you have hydrochloric acid? The stomach, that's right. And it's going to mix it with a weak base, sodium bicarbonate. Gee, where does that come from? The pancreas. So you wind up with a weak acid, okay, and a salt. So this decreases the pH slightly unless your alkaline reserve is used up. But remember, your kidneys are always preserving bicarbonate. And so hopefully your alkaline reserve is never used up. So if a strong base is added, like sodium hydroxide, and it's going to mix with the carbonic acid, weak acid, that gives us a very weak base, sodium sodium bicarbonate, sodium hydroxide, sodium bicarbonate, which is a weaker base, and water. And so this allows pH to rise only slightly because the protons tie up the base. So when we look at carbonic acid, it's almost limitless because when we talk about CO2 being released by respiration, what's formed, guys? Think back to bicarbonate and carbonic acid and carbonic anhydrase, and how all this is moving CO2. So these are respiratory controls. respiratory controls. It is so very cool how God uses hydrogen. One proton, one electron, but it balances our body. That is absolutely fascinating. Okay, the third system is the phosphate buffer system. The phosphate buffer system. And its components are the sodium salts of dihydrogen phosphate, which is a weak acid, and monohydrogen phosphate, which is a weak base. So sodium dihydrogen phosphate and sodium monohydrogen phosphate. When we look at this, it is very effective in urine and the intracellular fluid. Okay, and this is because this is where phosphate concentrations are high. So when a proton, hydrogen is released by strong acids, it's tied up with a weak acid. So HCl is tied up with sodium, right, bicarbonate, and it turns into sodium dihydrogen phosphate. Sorry, that's not sodium bicarbonate. That's sodium phosphate. My apologies. When a strong acid like HCl is mixed with a weak base like sodium phosphate, then we get a weak acid, sodium dihydrogen phosphate, and sodium chloride. All right? When strong bases are converted, then we have sodium hydroxide mixed with sodium dihydrogen phosphate, and we wind up with sodium phosphate, a weak base, and water. Notice we're a lot of metabolic water. Now, another system is the protein buffer system. Okay, the protein buffer system. And this uses intracellular proteins. Plasma proteins work well, but intracellular proteins do most of the work. So protein molecules are amphoteric. They can function both as a weak acid and a weak base. So when pH rises, carboxyl groups can release the protons, and that's going to help pH decrease. When pH decreases, becomes acidic, then the NH2, the amino groups, can bind hydrogen and make NH3. So here we go. This just blows my mind that we're dealing with the simplest atom, hydrogen, and how it has an incredible effect on our body. I think hemoglobin does a great job of functioning as an intracellular buffer in the red blood cells. So here we are at a quick summary of chemical buffer systems. So I like this chart because it tells you the three systems, bicarbonate, phosphate, and protein, and tells you what's going on and where it is primarily taking place. So this is a very important summary chart, and you need to write this down in your notes. So take a break and get this down in your notes. So we've talked about the chemical buffer system. Let's look at how God uses our lungs to regulate protons. Okay? So we have the respiratory and the renal systems are our physiological buffering systems. They are our physiological buffering systems. So they are going to keep everything physiological Buffering systems. They act more slowly than the chemical system, but they have more buffering power, a lot more buffering power. So we see here where CO2 plus water gives us carbonic acid, which dissociates into protons and bicarbonate. So you can see protons and bicarbonate influencing our pH levels. Okay? So when we look at this, during carbon dioxide unloading, the reaction is going to shift and protons will be incorporated into water. During CO2 loading, the reaction shifts and protons are going to be buffered by proteins. So when we look at this, right, here we go. Look at this. Look at this. Think about water, okay, water, and then proteins taking up the the protons. Think about this proton here being taken up into, right, carbonic acid, and also being taken up by proteins. Remember, that's the amino end, the amino end. Okay, so if the partial pressure of PO2 increases in the blood, that is called hypercapnia. Sorry. And what this does, it activates the medullary chemoreceptors, and that is going to cause an increase in respiratory rate and depth. So what are you taking in? You're taking in oxygen, right? Respiratory rate and depth. You're taking in oxygen. It means you're blowing off CO2. Okay? Rising plasma protons, acidosis, is going to cause an increase. Let's try again. It's going to cause an increase in respiration rate and depth. You're taking in more oxygen, blowing off more CO2. So as you're blowing off CO2, you're removing CO2 from the blood, and that's going to reduce the proton concentration. If you reduce proton concentration, then you're going to increase pH. Alkalosis is going to depress the respiratory system, okay? And so you're not going to be breathing in and out as fast or as deep, and that causes an increase in proton concentration. And so that means what? Acidosis. So hypoventilation causes respiratory acidosis, and hyperventilation causes respiratory alkalosis, right? Respiratory Let's try it one more time, guys. This neuropathy is getting worse. Respiratory alkalosis. Hypoacidosis. Hyperalkalosis.